Good morning. My name is John Olthuis, and with who I consider my very significant other, Lois Kunkel, and our son Matthew, who sometimes darkens the doors at TSP, I've been happily a member here for about 20 years. And this morning, I'd like to pay tribute to Anishinaabe elder Carol Terry, who is with us. Carol is from Sioux Lookout, and she's been a friend of Lois's for 45 years, and a friend of mine more recently. She works as a part of the grandparents group that's working at St. Mike's Hospital to try and work with healthcare professionals to try and integrate Indigenous knowledge into the mainstream healthcare system, as well as many other things that she does. So very, very happy that she's with us this morning, and she'll be around if you want to have some discussion with her about the significance of that project. Carol, would you just stand up for a moment so people could see you? Yeah. I've been an Aboriginal rights activist and lawyer for going on 50 years. And one of the first things I did was work with the Dene in the Northwest Territories around the Mackenzie Valley Pipeline and Berger inquiry. And at that time, I said, how can I help? And I was told in no uncertain terms, look, we have been self-determining for thousands of years. We know who we are. We have had our own political, economic, social systems and our own spirituality for thousands of years. The problem is that your colonial systems, institutions, attitudes have come in and made it difficult, if not impossible, for us to be self-determining. So if you want to help us work at clearing away, decolonizing your institutions, political, economic, social institutions, and your attitudes of superiority and colonialism. And I have tried to take that to heart, and it's very, very difficult to do because it isn't like the water in Amos that it flows constantly. It's kind of intermittent as I think all of us try to move from being part of an assimilationist and colonial society to a society that creates the space for self-determination. But I've been privileged to work with First Nations for 50 years. I was part of the repatriation of the Constitution in 1982, part of the legal team that negotiated Section 35 with the provinces in Canada, which acknowledged in the Constitution and recognized and affirmed the Aboriginal and treaty rights of Aboriginal, Indigenous, and Métis and Inuit peoples. I worked on Charlottetown, which attempted to get into the Constitution the provisions for self-government for First Nations people, and of course that failed because of the national referendum in which that was in 1992, you had to vote for the whole package, and if you didn't like Senate reform but liked the Aboriginal reform, you voted against the whole package. I've also been privileged to work with Grassy Narrows that a lot of you know about in the Mercury over many, many years, and there's an article in the TSP Times by Lynn Johnnerville about his visit to Grassy with the Christian Peacemakers, with the Innu in Labrador fighting a NATO base and low-level flying and negotiating a modern treaty with Temagami in the old-growth forest and so on. And I've tried to live out this concept of clearing away our institutional colonialism so First Nations can emerge. And of course, that's what the TSP working group here that you've heard from the members about and the attempts, the art garden, the lending library, and all the work that they do. And in 2016, we started paying the rent, which is the sort of twice a year symbolically collecting money. We can't pay the rent because we could never afford to do that, but it's a symbolic paying rent, which now goes to Name-Res, the Native Men's Resource Center, and the Native Women's Resource Center. And the United Church has had a very long history of working, of having Indigenous people within the church. And it's a somewhat shameful and complicated history. And the United Church has had to issue 2 apologies. The first apology in 1986, which is written in your bulletin, and which is also in your handout, ends with these words. We ask you to forgive us and to walk together with us in the light of Christ so that our peoples may be blessed and God's creation healed. Now, the Indigenous Circle within the United Church has never accepted that apology. They have acknowledged it 2 years later in 1988, and they said, "We hope and pray that the apology is not symbolic, but that the words are words of action and sincerity." And then in 1998, and that apology is on the first page of your handout, was the second apology to former residential school survivors and their families of the United Church residential schools. And that ends with these words: "We pray that you will hear the sincerity of our words today and that you will witness the living out of our apology in our actions in the future." Well, the Indigenous Circle within the church has been sort of thinking about that, and the occasion for the restructuring of the United Church, which, as you know, has happened recently, was an occasion in which the Indigenous Circle made a number of calls to action to the United Church. And there's the first 3 pages of those on your handout, and those are followed by 9 calls to the church. And I'd like to read just a few portions from what they said, and this was in 2018. They said, "The United Nation Declaration is about establishing and maintaining traditional, respectful relationships, Indigenous government and Indigenous land rights in their traditional territory." And then they say, "This means the Indigenous faith community must exercise a truly Indigenous self-determination and possess a sustainable land-based support." And they say, "The United Church has apologized for its colonial application of the policy of assimilation and acknowledged its impoverishment by the rejection of our Indigenous understanding of spirituality." And they go on to say, "And we want now right relations." They also say this, and this is where the sort of, this is where it really comes against us in terms of what action. They say, look, the United Church is asset rich in land and properties. These lands were stolen by false promises in treaty negotiations. We meant to invite settlers to our lands and that we would share it. It would feed us both. But we are cut off from the land. Justice in land matters must be about reparations and not only apologies. Reconciliation is not just heads and hearts that feel bad, but hands and feet that do tangible good. Selling church properties is a matter of Indigenous land justice or injustice. And they go on in the calls to action, and they're very, very powerful calls to action. They're very challenging to the church. They go on in the number 8 of the calls to action, go on to say, listen, when you sell church buildings, we think that a percentage of the proceeds should be allocated to indigenous ministry and justice work. They say they want an equitable distribution of mission and service funds, keeping in mind the whole indigenous community across the country. And they say that since the United Church says it is sorry, since we say that we believe in the UN Declaration, and since we say we want to live out the apology, well, how are we going to respond to these 8 calls for action? So yes, we are, and we confess we are, a church that has been guilty of assimilation and colonialism for the very indigenous people who were part of us. And in some ways that's, it's very, very sobering, of course, to acknowledge that. And we also have to acknowledge that the church has tried to do quite a bit in the past number of years since the apology, but obviously a lot more remains to be done. In some ways, though, it is not surprising because the church is in a public sphere where assimilation and colonialism has been the flavor of many years. It's 50 years ago this year, in 1969, that Pierre Trudeau, who was Prime Minister, and Jean Chrétien as his Minister of Indian Affairs, tabled a white paper. And the white paper said, we've done all this, assimilation. A lot of it, of course, was genocidal, as the church and other institutions have acknowledged. Now's the time to do away with any special status for indigenous people. Doing away with the Indian Act, which was fine, but there was no replacement, so it was to complete assimilation. There was a huge pushback from the indigenous community about that. And Canada withdrew the white paper, but it's my contention that we continue to be colonial in terms of our policies, our institutions, and our attitudes to First Nations people. And things like the residential school settlement, the settlement for the 60 Scoop and so, are really, that's not justice. Those are reparations, just partial reparations for horrendous treatment of First Nations people over many years. That's at best charity and being forced to say, well, we're sorry, so here's a little money, but the legacy is for many generations. Today we have in many, many Aboriginal communities mold in houses, very, very inadequate, unhealthy housing. Education standards are still very low. Healthcare is terrible. Boil water. Can you imagine if on your street, after 20 years, you would get together with your neighbors and say, oh my goodness, 2/3 of our street now has clean drinking water. Let's celebrate. After 20 years. And recently, a few years ago, we decided to put $62 billion to buy new military jets and merchant ships. And over the years, there's very little put towards boil water for getting First Nation communities out of boil water. We have an Indigenous budget federally of about $8 billion, most of which is spent in Ottawa by more than 5,000 bureaucrats and across the country at regional offices of Indigenous Affairs, the 2 branches now. And You talk to many First Nations people and they're saying they're still administering our misery. They're still trying to come up with policies which are actually colonial policies to solve problems created by colonialism. So mainstream society is still not doing a very good job. We're still very colonial. We run through Indian Affairs, through government agencies, we run programs. We design and run programs for First Nations people. So, what can we do about all this? Well, this obviously requires structural change. So one of the things that First Nations have been calling for a long time is dismantle Indian Affairs entirely. It has to be done over a bit of time. But take that $8 billion, put it into the hands of First Nations community, and allow them to determine their own programs, their laws, how they want to run their affairs based on their own values, their spirituality, their culture, and their way of life. And return to them an adequate land and resource base so that they can actually develop themselves the revenues, not be dependent and beg and go and try and negotiate every year for a little more money from the colonial government. And I think the implementation of First Nation laws, even though Section 35 is in the Constitution, if First Nations want to pass laws for their own education system, they have to negotiate that and get the agreement of a federal government and the provincial government in which they are. That's not inherent government, that's remaining colonialism. Assimilation at best leads to charity, and self-determination means justice. So here at TSP we have this Aboriginal working group, and you've heard about some of their work. So what can we do? Well, for one thing, I think join the Indigenous working group. It's very difficult in a working group when there's a massive number of problems to face. What are we going to do? And the Indigenous working group has been struggled with that, and through that done some very interesting things. One of the things I think that can be done is to sit down with the calls to action of the Indigenous Circle. It's an 11-page document. I've printed the first 3 pages. You have it. But the actual 9 calls to action, you can find it online. And I think it would be a great thing if we would sit together in Indigenous working group, or whoever wants to do that, talk about how we at TSP can advocate within the United Church that the calls to action be taken seriously by the National Church and implemented. And we can do that by reaching out to the Toronto Native Urban Ministry, which is an urban ministry that is sponsored by the United Church and the Anglican Church. Talk to them about how they feel about the appropriate ways of actually responding to these calls for action and doing that. The example of the Climate Justice Working Group here at TSP is a great one to follow in that, starting here and leading up to the proposals for the National Church to divest from fossil fuels. It started right here in the rooms at TSP with the working group, and surely the Indigenous working group can be the same, do the same. And there's also 2 calls for action that are in your handout. 45 from the TRC, which is to develop a royal proclamation of reconciliation. It would be great to have a small working group saying, what would that look like? What would that look like? An actual royal proclamation of reconciliation. It seems to me that there'd be a lot in there about structural change and decolonizing, working to decolonize our own institutions and our attitudes wherever we are. We could work at that as one of the small, say, subgroups of the working group. And number 5 of the TRC calls, which was a covenant of reconciliation amongst those who signed the residential school settlement, including the church. Again, that's been sitting there idle since the call has been made. We could have a working group that works at suggesting to the United Church what the United Church thinks should go in a covenant of national reconciliation. And so those are just a few suggestions for what we can do to actually live out the apology that goes back to, 1986 and 1998. And as we do that, I think, we're people of faith, and I think we thank God for the Gospels and for what we've heard this morning. Often think of like Amos. Amos was a shepherd, and he was called to castigate the political and religious leaders of northern Israel. What for? For divorcing the religious ceremonies from actually matters of justice and righteousness, for forgetting about the poor and the marginalized. And that's really inspiring to. And I think that's the kind of voice we need to be. And Amos says, what's required is this mighty flood of justice and an endless river of righteous living. I love that imagery. And that what we do in our righteous living must not be intermittent, but it has to be constant, the kind that flows down like water in an everlasting stream. So the water that flows down never stops, and he's saying, and our living for justice must not stop. And I think that applies to, and what we can do with all the imagination, creativity at TSP, we can do something to apply that to our Aboriginal neighbors. And what Paul says in the Corinthian passage that Sandy also read, that because we're reconciled to our Creator, that makes us ambassadors of reconciliation, to work for reconciliation. Again, I think the message is live out that reconciliation wherever you are in relationship. And we're now in this tenuous relationship with the Indigenous folks within our own denomination and then outside. And then Psalm 51, if we're doing that, we have to do it with a broken and contrite heart. We have to do it seeking forgiveness. And again, if we're to live out this apology that the church has made to Indigenous people, we have to do that. So those are some of these suggestions that I think we can do here, and follow that up in delving deeper. It's a wonderful thing to have the poetry that's going to lead off that session. And for those of you who know me, I'm a big fan of the Sufi master Hafiz, a 14th century poet. And one of his poems, I'm going to conclude with that, says this: I am a hole in the flute that the Christ's breath moves through. Listen to the music. Again, I am a hole in the flute that the Christ breath moves through. Listen to the music. Let us at TSP be part of that hole in the flute that is Christ's breath for justice for Indigenous people, for our neighbors within the church and in the public square. And let us together make reconciliation music to demonstrate that we not only take the apology seriously, but that we're committed in community to living out that apology with our Aboriginal neighbors in the church and throughout Canada. So let it be.